Bueno, las buenas tardes para todos.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating in this previous session of GALA Angus in its 19th version. And as the Angus Society has always been innovative, always together jointly with science and research, this year the managing committee decided to invite Kelli Retallick, who is in charge of the breeding program of American Angus. And we also have John Stika, who is responsible of the certified Angus beef program that is over 40 years old in the United States, and they have succeeded in making it recognized at a global level. Really, they have transformed the Angus name. It's no longer just a breed, it's a beef brand. So all Angus breeders are grateful for their excellent work of the CAB. So without further ado, I'll leave you with John Stika, who will give a brief presentation, and after that we'll have a presentation by Kelli Retallick, who will tell us about working in breeding in the United States. And
Así que John, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You understand everything.
I heard you say my name.
Entendí que decías mi nombre y me presentaste, y ya con eso me alcanza. Bienvenidos a todos, muchas gracias por venir. Esto es previo a la gala. Bueno, le está repitiendo lo que se dijo recién.
To have Kelli here and you here.
Thank you.
And then, so Kelli as the president of the HGI, and you as the responsible for CMB. So,
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It is truly an honor to have the opportunity to be here and just share a few comments with you. Both myself and Clint Wallencheck, who is up here at the table, who's our Vice President of Product Services, who works with all of our processors around the world that we collaborate with, have truly enjoyed our time here in Uruguay this last week. It has been a phenomenal opportunity. And I just want to say thank you for the incredible hospitality that you and your entire country have shown us while we're here. The things that you are accomplishing in your industry in Uruguay have been extremely insightful for us. And in all honesty, it is easy to see the progress that is being made in terms of quality and in your beef industry here in Uruguay. And it's easy to understand why consumer acceptance of your products around the world continues to grow. And as we traveled around and went to the packing plants and went to some cattle feed yards and so forth, it's easy to also see why you're enthusiastic as Angus breeders. Because just as we see in the United States and across North America, your Angus cattle only continue to grow in domination of the breeding programs here in Uruguay. And I think that says a lot about the things that we're experiencing as an Angus community here in Uruguay, in North America, and elsewhere around the world. So I guess I would just tell you that if you continue down the path you're on, just like we see in North America, you will prosper as Angus breeders moving forward. So congratulations on that. I just want to take a few moments here ahead of Kelli to share with you a little perspective about certified Angus beef. The brand this year celebrated 45 years in existence, and so we've been marketing certified Angus beef on behalf of America's Angus breeders now for 4.5 decades. And it's been an interesting time. It hasn't always been easy. Over the course of these 45 years, there was a period early on in the brand's beginning where it survived by a vote of 8-5 on whether or not the brand was going to continue forward for a lot of different reasons. We're very thankful that the board voted to continue with the brand, because today, for American breeders and breeders across North America, the brand has been very valuable in adding value to their registered Angus genetics. And so again, history has taught us a lot, and fortunately we're to be in the position that we are here 45 years later. I just want to share that as a brand, we have one mission. being owned by the American Angus Association and the breeders that make up that association, our mission is to increase demand for their cattle. I think what is very visionary about these individuals that started the brand 45 years ago was that they realized that to create value for the members of the association, they had to focus on the people the farthest away from farming and ranching country. They had to focus on the needs and the demands of consumers and deliver a product to them that they were willing to pay for. And ultimately, those dollars would flow back through the production chain, and I'll touch on that here in a moment. So if I were to say it differently, we exist in America for two reasons. The very first reason is to create a way for consumers to easily identify the product that is going to perform beyond their expectations for taste, juiciness, and flavor every time they buy it. And we do that by bringing a set of specifications together and identifying that product with the Certified Angus Beef logo so that they don't have to be a meat scientist to purchase the great beef product. They just have to have the ability to see the logo and trust it. Whether it's in Dubai or in Des Moines, Iowa, or elsewhere around the world, they know that that product is going to be the same in terms of its quality. The second thing we have to accomplish is we have to then be able to transition that trust that consumers have in the brand into real dollars and cents for producers. If we fail to deliver elevated value for the kind of cattle that supply the brand, then we ultimately don't deliver on our mission statement. So those are the two things we have to do: create trust with consumers and then create value, real dollar value that goes into the pockets of farming and ranching families raising Angus cattle. And that's really why we exist and what we've been working at for the last 45 years. We do that by focusing on every segment of the supply chain. The brand is owned by Angus producers, but we focus all of our attention on the consumer. Because if the consumer is willing to pay more for a great, consistent eating experience that's merchandised as certified Angus beef, well, then the restaurant and the retailer are going to pay more to access that product. The distributor who services that retailer is going to pay more for that product. The packer is going to pay more for feeder cattle that qualify, or fat cattle, fed cattle that qualify for the brand. The feed yard will pay more to the cow-calf producer, and ultimately, for those of us in this room, the goal is for the cow-calf producer to pay more for a registered Angus bull with the carcass merit and the EPDs and genetic predictions to produce cattle that can hit the mark. And so we focus as a brand in partnership with Kelli and Angus Genetics Incorporated, with the American Angus Association and others to, again, connect these dots and help that economic signal flow clear from the pocket of consumers into the pockets of producers that raise Angus cattle. For a bit of awareness about how we're structured, we're a not-for-profit organization. We're owned by the American Angus Association and its breeders. We are governed by a board of Angus breeders that raise Angus cattle from a brand standpoint. To give you some idea in terms of how we're structured, we're a bit like Uber. Uber is the largest transportation company in the world, doesn't own a single car. We are a brand that has grown in scope over the last 45 years. We don't own a single cow. We don't own a single farm or ranch. We don't own a packing plant or a retail store. We never take ownership of product. What we own is we own a Ford Taurus, some buildings in Worcester, Ohio, and this logo. And it's our job to leverage and protect the value of this logo so that other people that we depend on to communicate that economic signal can create value for their business as well. Everybody who touches the brand has to win for us to deliver on our mission statement. We are, like I said earlier, we are a not-for-profit organization, but we're not non-revenue. Okay, we generate our revenue by collecting a commission on every pound of product that the packer uses where the brand is leveraged in that transaction. Okay, so when they sell a certified Angus beef strip loin into a domestic market or an international market somewhere around the world, we collect a commission. And it varies from a higher level of 7 cents on strip loins to a penny on round cuts and so forth and so on. And we track every pound of product that moves through the system in our bag, in our box, with our brand attached to it. And that's how we govern that commission model. Those dollars then go into driving the marketing efforts of the brand. We merchandise over 1.2 billion pounds of product around the world into 54 different countries each and every year. To supply that program, we rely on certifying 5.8 million carcasses a year in 35 plants that we work with in the U.S. and in Canada currently. And we have a team of about 160 people, primarily located in the U.S., but with some folks in other parts of the world that we depend on to engage with the customer, engage with the restaurateur, the retailer, the distributor, to again create that excitement and focus on selling the brand and representing quality in the market. And ultimately then all that effort is meant to deliver value back to the producer. And the last number we reported from a couple years ago is that over $182 million flowed from the packer back into the pockets of producers focused on feeding Angus cattle for a target on certified Angus beef. So that gives you some perspective in terms of how we function and how we're trying to accomplish and go about delivering on that mission statement. This gives you some idea in terms of how the brand has grown over its 45 years. This is a brand that had very, very small beginnings. And I think it just speaks to a lot of things that we do in agriculture. This is nothing more. The brand was never meant to be large. The brand is just a great idea that ultimately had success because of the way that people and breeders and end users and partners engage the brand. And that's really this tonnage is really a reflection of how a commitment and a shared focus on quality can create value for everybody from the consumer clear back to the producer. I think one of the things that's very important in this slide is if you look from 2008 till right before COVID, okay? And that was a period of time in 2008 when we saw the global economic downturn in terms of the economy, a period of time where we would have expected premium brands, Angus brands, to see decreases in sales, decreases in demand. And what we actually saw is that we saw increase in the demand that consumers had for a premium product. And what that really taught us is it's not about price. It's about price in relation to value. And the more value you provide, the more a consumer is willing to pay. And so we have really learned a lot and have focused on that, trying to drive that point home, that it is really price in relation to value. And I think as we talk about brands and how do we create more demand for our cattle, I think it really always comes back to what's my consumer and customer wanting, and how can I deliver on that value, and then how can I, again, deliver a higher price for delivering a better than average product. One of the questions that we often get is, what cattle qualify for the brand? To qualify as being eligible for certified Angus beef, as well as virtually every Angus brand in North America, depending on the packing plant, is that the cattle have to be predominantly solid black. No white behind the shoulder, no white above the flank, no white over the top, except for maybe the tail. The switch, they can have a little white on them. So those top two steers that you see in this slide would be the kind of cattle that are eligible for Angus programs. That does not make them certified Angus beef. That just makes them Angus type or Angus influenced in their genetic makeup. What makes them certified Angus beef is ultimately then those cattle that are eligible have to be evaluated for these 10 specifications for product and eating quality, such as a modest degree of marbling, a fine marbling texture for young cattle less than 30 months of age. They have to then be evaluated for product consistency, ribeye areas between 10 and 16 inches. I learned that 1,100-pound carcass is a monster down here, okay, with regards to carcass size. And so obviously that specification would be very logically to be met by the cattle that are produced here in Uruguay. And so we have different industries with regards to ultimate carcass size. But as long as they're not over 1,100 pounds, product consistency and size consistency is very much ideal. Less than an inch of fat, as you can see there. And then other components such as a low percentage of zebu, as we identify based on the less than an inch, 2 inches of hump height, for tenderness concerns, and then moderately thicker muscling, and then some visual perception quality traits as practically free of capillary ruptures, and of course no dark cutters. When a carcass from Angus heritage meets those 10 specs, then it ultimately is determined to be certified Angus beef. This gives you some idea in terms of how our brand and our supply chain has grown over the years. Today, like I mentioned earlier, we certify almost 6 million carcasses a year, and this doesn't happen by chance. This happens because somewhere along the line there's a genetic or an economic pull that says these Angus cattle are worth more in the marketplace. And that really is what drove our ability to certify more cattle, to access more supply, to increase sales in North America and around the world. And like I said, this doesn't happen by chance. This happens through economics. And what we've seen in the U.S. industry is, I think what I've gathered is where the Uruguayan industry is headed as well, to where Angus is going to continue to grow to be the dominant breed of influence in your country, in your beef industry. And what we've seen in the United States is certified Angus beef went from being a niche program not too many years ago, just 2006, we were less than 6% of the entire industry. Today, because of those economics, because of the focus on quality, the brand represents almost 22% of all fed cattle harvested in the United States industry, versus Select, which is a very commodity, low-quality product that we produce in our industry. So again, I think this speaks very well to what the future for Angus in Uruguay can represent. I think it could be very much mirror what we saw in the United States. And again, that just comes because of economic pull. This slide represents a couple different things, and what I would say is if you look at the green and the red towards the very bottom, the statements, in our grading system in the United States, we have Select is low quality, Choice is acceptable, Certified Angus beef is premium, and then we have Certified Angus beef and Prime above that. You can see there that USDA Choice sells at an 8.5% premium to USDA Select. Higher quality product is worth more. Where we talk about the value of brands is the ability to add value above the commodity. And what we're very proud of is Certified Angus beef last year generated almost a 6% premium over the premium that Choice was already creating over Select. And we do that not just by selling middle meats, ribs, strips, and tenders, and top butts, and tenderloins, and so forth. We do it by creating more value for the chuck. Certified Angus beef ground beef, flat irons, terrace majors, quality chuck rolls, creating almost 4% or 3.5% premium for round cuts, eye rounds, inside rounds, bottom round flats. Those items that tend to be very commodity, we're able to create a premium for, and again, create that economic pull-through. That then flows back to producers. To today, a carcass that certifies as Certified Angus beef is worth almost $100 a head more above the base in the U.S. fed cattle marketing system. It's not, I don't know about it here, but it's hard to find an easy $100 in the States. And I can't imagine it's any easier in Uruguay to find ways to increase profitability by some selection differences in terms of genetics and maybe a few management adjustments as well to target a higher level of marbling in the final product. That then, one of the things that we focus on with Kelli's help and Angus Genetics Incorporated is how do we communicate to producers the tools that are available to help them target those dollars that we saw, so that their Angus genetics are targeted for a more profitable endpoint for the cow-calf producer that ultimately is going to buy them. And some of you might be aware of this logo. If you look on Angus pedigree lookup and so forth on the website, you might see some pedigrees with the circular targeting the brand logo. When those pedigrees have that logo that says they have the criteria for marbling and $G or dollar grid, that are disproportionately skewed toward producing certified Angus beef. And so that's just one tool that we use to help Angus breeders identify and help their customers identify which genetics can help move their herd and from a quality standpoint closer to the brand. You know, this is one of the last slides I have that just kind of talk about over the last 45 years we've worked really hard. And I mentioned that $182 million in premiums, but I think what really is important, what we've experienced as an industry that has been led by the Angus breeders in the United States is the fact that we've seen a mental shift in our industry in the United States. And it's one that thinks less about producing something and more about producing into something. What am I producing cattle into? What kind of brand am I producing into? What kind of consumer demand pull am I producing into? As opposed to just saying I'm producing X pounds of a generic product to go into a commodity market. And I really think that you are you're well into the shift towards a mentality about producing into something. And I think as you do, I just wish you a tremendous amount of congratulations on where you're at. and a tremendous amount of goodwill on where you're headed with your industry to continue to produce into a demand market that values Angus and values premium quality Angus at a higher value that's going to return more dollars to your operations and those of your customers. I put this last slide in here only to point out that it doesn't happen overnight. Certified Angus beef is often called the overnight success that's taken 45 years to build. We were in existence for 9 years before a producer ever saw an economic premium for targeting certified Angus beef. It doesn't happen fast, and this is a copy of that very premium that was paid. But I would tell you that the effort to continue to evolve and lead your industry towards a quality endpoint through Angus genetics is one that's worth fighting, and it's one that will pay dividends long term. So with that, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to share a few comments. Kelli has a lot more, better information that I have to share, but I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you and to share a little perspective from our side about branded beef. So thank you very much. Perfect.
Thank you, John. We hope to have the CAB in Uruguay very soon.
We hope so. We look forward to continuing to collaborate. Very much. Thank you.
Bueno, a continuación tenemos la presentación de Kelli Retallick. Kelli Retallick es la presidenta de AGI, Angus Genetic Incorporation.
Yes.
Así que, adelante. Speak slowly.
I'll do my best. I get excited about genomics and genetics and what we do at AGI. And so Luis has had to deal with me all week as I continue to speak really rapid, right? So I'll try to speak slowly today, and hopefully we have some time for questions at the end. So again, just like John, I just want to say thank you guys for inviting me here to Uruguay to speak to you on behalf of AGI, to talk about a little bit about what we're doing with genomics, genetic evaluation, and then this new technology of gene editing, and the exciting space that we're in to try to create high quality beef and cattle that work in many different environments. Just to give you a bit of background of kind of where the association in the US started with genetic improvement, I think this slide really speaks testament to the long storied history we've had in data collection and genetic improvement. And when you think about when the association was founded in 1883 and really started capitalizing on maintaining that herd book, we recorded our millionth registration in 1944. And then really from there, where we come in from a genetic perspective was in 1958, right, when that Angus Herd Improvement Records program was started. That's our database of records. That database of records that we were able to continue to grow. And then in 1974, having our first sire evaluation report. So today, that sire evaluation report, right, that's our every 6-month annual or biannual report that we use, has about 15,000 bulls in it, right, recorded bulls of American Angus registrations. That first one had 25 bulls, right? 3 of them were dead by the time it was printed, okay? And it took a really long time to get to that first sire evaluation report. Fast forward to where we are today, about 50 years later, we are now on our 1 millionth, recorded our 20 millionth registration and our 1 millionth genotype in 2021. So we've really had a long storied history, and our first genomic EPD was then released in 2009, and that really set the precedent for where we're going to continue this conversation today. So when we talk about what happened in 2009 and we started incorporating the 50K data, right, or that DNA data into our genetic evaluation, it was really a shift, a monumental shift in genetic improvement. And we worked primarily with 2 companies, Pfizer at the time and Muriel, now known as Zoetis and Neogen. And what we were doing was much like where you guys started about 5 years ago. I learned about how you were building your training population within your own country, trying to build your databases. And that's the same thing we were embarking on prior to 2009. When we hit 2009, we had those molecular breeding values that we could fit into those genomically enhanced EPDs that allowed us to publish weekly genomic enhanced EPDs for our Angus producers. And the reason we switched to a weekly genetic evaluation at that time was the fact that we had producers investing nearly 75 to 100 US dollars per animal to test those animals for their, with their DNA, for their genotypes, and we wanted to be sure that we could get that information to them as quickly as possible. And so not only did we incorporate genomics in 2009, that's when we switched from a 6-month biannual genetic evaluation to a weekly genetic evaluation as well. The one thing that we learned over time, though, was that in the type of evaluation that we were doing, it was called a multi-step evaluation. It was feasible and it was available and it allowed us to deliver, right, genomically enhanced EPDs to the marketplace. But the one thing that it didn't do is that it didn't eliminate our need for that training population, right? And so when you have that training population, you can't just create it and never update it. You have to continue to feed it. And what would happen over time is that we would have to periodically, right, update that training population, and it would cause a large re-ranking, right, in our bulls because we added more genotypes, we added more data, we added more information, and we would have basically a shift, a re-ranking of bulls, which obviously, right, doesn't allow our breeders to have the most up-to-date information as possible. So then, with the advent of single step, right, driven by the University of Georgia there in the US, you all work with the same software we work with here in Uruguay that we work with in the US now. But what this single step evaluation did was it allowed us to transition away from those training populations. Right? It allowed us to basically remove the risk of double counting that we had before. It eliminated the need for that re-ranking or that periodic shift in our genetic evaluations. And it really helped us to be able to have a more accurate and timely genetic evaluation for our breeders. But the issue that was already creeping in, right, as we were starting to talk about putting in this new technology, was the idea that in 2013, Angus was, the American Angus Association was already approaching 150,000 genotypes. Okay, so visualize this with me. If you guys have a big spreadsheet and you have, right, 150,000 animals in the rows and 50,000, right, 50,000 columns, which equal the markers. And then basically what you have to go in and do for a genetic evaluation is you have to invert that thing on its head. Okay? That takes a long time, right? Those problems are really hard to solve. And so we needed to come up with better solutions in order to be able to utilize all of this great data that our members were collecting. And that's where we started to talk about basically a new technology called APY. And what APY does is it allows us to create the pedigree relationships, or redefines our pedigree relationships among animals. So just like your genetic evaluation that you're using here, with single step, basically what we're doing with that genotype, right, is we're establishing better genomic pedigree relationships. So if I have a bunch of animals, right, that I have genotypes on, basically what I can do is I can figure out where the genes were passed down from my ancestors. So if you think about this, you have two parents. You have a sire and we have a dam, right? They each deliver about 50% of the DNA down to that offspring, which makes sense, right? You have a sperm, you have an egg, they come together. That's what you have to work with. But that same random 50%, right? That's a random 50% each time. So I met two siblings here yesterday, right? These two siblings are great. They're full sibs, I believe, right? But the issue is, right, they're not exactly the same. Why aren't they exactly the same? Because they got a random 50% of genes down from their sire and their dam. Okay? So what this genomic prediction allows us to do is it allows us to track where am I getting more of my genes. So have you ever thought of one of your siblings or maybe one of your children and you say, you act just like your grandmother, or you act just like your grandfather, right? Well, some of that could actually be because they're getting more genes, right, from that particular ancestor. That's the same thing we're doing with your cattle. We're actually able to track those genomic pedigree relationships. So if I'm a young calf, right, that hasn't had the ability to put in any data into the system, basically I can look at his genomic relationships and I can understand, well, if he's more related to the high-performing marbling sire, right, because that high-performing sire does have information in the evaluation, guess what? We're going to jack up his marbling EPD because he has more of the genes from that particular ancestor. So as we think about how this really redefined the way we used genomics, this inclusion of this particular APY algorithm, as we like to call it, really was crucial for the American Angus success because it allowed us to use not only the 40,000 genotypes that we had in 2014 when we started thinking about single step, to actually being able to incorporate all the 1.5 million genotypes we have today. When we think about the promise of genotyping and really what we were promised at the beginning, we were promised increased accuracy and increased rate of genetic change. Okay, so we talk about adding genomics into that EPD equation. Why do we add genomics into that EPD equation? Because it increases the accuracies of our EPDs. Increasing the accuracy of the EPDs allows you to better select animals for the next generation. So that way you know that the animals we're picking this year are going to make the best parents in the future generations. What we've seen in American Angus is that for some of our core traits that we have up here, things like weaning weight, carcass weight, marbling, and ribeye, we've increased, right, our rate of genetic progress pretty considerably since the inclusion of genomics. So basically what you're looking at here on the screen is in the red, that's our standardized genetic progress before implementation of genomics, right? Think pre-2009. The gray bars are after, right, implementation of genomics, and you can see that we've increased the rate of genetic progress. The two that probably pop out to you is the milk, right, the leche, the milk EPD there, as well as the fat EPD, where we've actually decreased the rate of genetic progress in those two particular traits. To me, the understanding behind that is actually for our milk trait, the fact that breeders are trying to match the cattle to their environment, so they're actually holding, right, that genetic trend down a little bit to ensure that they have the feed resources to be able to provide maintenance energy requirements to those females. From a fat perspective, fat has to do with yield in our carcasses. Okay, so when we talk about what Dr. Sticka was just up here talking about with the Certified Angus Beef program, dressing percentage and yield, actually having a decrease in fat helps us from a terminal perspective when we're thinking about putting quality carcasses into the packing plant and a quality eating experience in front of the consumer. Let's talk a little bit about accuracy, because when I think about accuracy, I think the easiest way to think about how much value am I getting out of genomics is to think about how many progeny equivalents does a genotype actually add to my EPD prediction. So when I'm talking about progeny equivalents, I'm talking about the number of calves that would actually be in our genetic evaluation based on that level of accuracy. So if we come over here to something like calving ease is very important, especially when we're talking about young females. If I'm buying a bull, right, that has a genomically enhanced EPD for calving ease, it's like purchasing a bull that already has 25 calving ease progeny equivalents already in the genetic evaluation. Okay, so 25 progeny equivalents, meaning 25 calves recorded for calving ease already in our evaluation. In the States, we send out a young yearling bull and about 20 cows to cover in his first season if he's a natural service walking sire. So with a genotype and with our database that we're able to work with at American Angus, by having a genomic enhanced EPD for calving ease, it's like having a whole calf crop's worth of data already there for a commercial producer to purchase his yearling bull with less risk. And I think one thing that we've talked a lot about this week as I've been traveling around your beautiful country and looking at cows is the fact that even in the age of genomics, phenotypes will still remain king, meaning even in the age of genomics, even though we can take blood tests, we can take DNA, guess what? We still have to collect the data. And the reason why genomic prediction has been so successful for the American Angus Association is because the sheer number of phenotypes that we're able to take advantage of for these each individual traits. So yes, we have 1.5 million genotypes, but the fact that we have nearly 12 million birth weights in that genetic evaluation, hey, that's going to add a lot of prediction accuracy to this whole environment that we're working in. So where does the future lie? And I think this is kind of as we think about the next frontier and we think about all the other things that we're going to continue to conquer. Obviously, we just heard about the promise of genomics and that it's being realized. Right? We've increased the accuracies of our predictions, and I just showed you how we've been able to increase the genetic trends due to genomics in the American Angus Association population. When we think about our data recording and we think about genotyping, it's become a standard operating procedure for producers in the US. Nearly 68% of our new registrations each year are genotyped. Just to give you a little scope of how many animals that is, that's about 200 to 220,000 genotypes that we collect each year. We're registering about 300,000 new animals each and every year. This is no longer, well, I'm going to test my top bulls and I'm going to try to use it as a marketing tool. This is very much part of their standard operating procedure in the US. As we look at the research, as we continue to look for new traits, we continue to focus on management traits. We've come out with traits that have actually helped us select animals for specific environments. I lean towards our pulmonary arterial pressure EPD, our PAP EPD, that helps animals helps us to understand which animals are going to be more adaptable to high elevation environments. Okay, high altitude environments where they're a bit more stressed because it's a low oxygenated environment. When we think of something about heat stress, thermal tolerance, fescue tolerance, we have an early summer hair shedding EPD. Cows that slick off earlier in the summer, guess what? They do a better job of getting bred back. They also do a better job of weaning off a heavier calf. And so as we think about all these tools we've been able to put out into the industry, we're going to continue to focus on some of these environmental traits that allow us to really adapt cattle to certain environments, because we want Angus to be a solution, whether that's in the Northwest, in Washington, where we have Angus producers, down to Florida, and all the way in Uruguay. We want these Angus animals to be solutions for every beef situation that we have around the globe. With that, when we talk about genomics, we don't have a huge foothold in the commercial cow-calf sector. What I'm talking about there is that we don't have a lot of commercial breeders that are actually using genomic testing in their individual commercial cow-calf herds. They're really seeing the value of genomics through the sires that they're selecting and sending into their cow herd. From there, as we talk about how else can we really open the window of transparency to genomics, we talk about the genetic descriptions of feeder cattle. In the US, we have a program that actually allows us to identify groups of cattle that groups of feeder cattle that potentially will gain more and grade better once they enter the feedlot and get hung on the rail. This has been something that's helped us try again and try to basically drive back premiums back to our commercial cow-calf producers, as well as our registered Angus seed stock producers by providing commercial cow-calf producers with the tools to select the right bulls to bring into their commercial operations. And then that last point that we talked about is the fact that actual phenotypes are going to continue to anchor, right, everything that we do in genomics. And so we got to continue to collect the data. Something new, though, that we've just started to talk about, right, is this whole idea of gene editing, right? And when we talk about gene editing, we're talking about this true definition. So basically, gene editing is the alteration of genetic material inside a living organism by either inserting a piece of DNA, right, deleting a piece of DNA sequence, or in most times we're aiming it at one specific trait that's basically turned on or off by one or two genes. So gene-edited products are all around us. If you go anywhere in there, we have things like BT corn. There in the middle, those are purple potatoes, right? No one grows purple potatoes in the wild. If you didn't know that, that's a gene-edited purple potato that we eat today. We have glow-in-the-dark fish, right? You go to aquariums and you see glow-in-the-dark fish. That's not normal. So people can buy those things as pets. Down there in the corner, that's actually a food animal that is approved for consumption in the U.S. That's a GAL-safe pig. Okay, so GAL-safe pigs were created because when people get Lyme disease, they become allergic to meat, and so a GAL-safe pig actually allows them to be able to eat meat due to that allergen in their body. And then the other food animal that's available in the U.S. there is this transatlantic salmon. As you can see, this is the one that's gene-edited. That was gene-edited in a growth promotant hormone that allows them to yield bigger fillets. Okay, so this is not new to our world, but it seems like it's really increased in the amount of conversation that's been taking place around gene edits as we're getting closer to commercialization on a much larger scale. So why would we entertain gene editing in cattle at all? Okay, when we think about that question, two things in my mind pop up. The first one, right, is the length of our generation interval. Okay, cattle have a long generation interval. We have one of the longest generation intervals in food animal production. If you think of something like chickens or you think of something like pigs, right, they have a much shorter gestation length, right? Pigs are a multiparious species, right? So they can have litters of animals instead of just one singular animal. So when we look at something like trying to gene edit a specific gene inside of cattle, the fact that we have a long generation interval, this could really help us speed up our rate of genetic progress because we don't have to wait so long to create, right, the new progeny each and every year. I think that other point is the point that it's a really simple one for us to understand, is that if we have a trait that's impossible, right, to input into our population due to breeding, or that's very hard to input into our populations to make genetic improvement, i.e. think of something like disease, right, tick resistance, BRD resistance, BVDV resistance, some of those sorts of things that aren't natural or we don't have selection tools for already, being able to gene edit some of those things into our animals could really speed up our rate of genetic progress for those specific traits. So how do we think this could actually work? So when I think about this, I obviously think that gene editing is going to be used in tandem with a couple of other things. One, everything we just talked about, right? Genomic selection, EPDs, the things that you guys are all currently doing today, as well as things around your advanced reproductive technologies, right? Artificial insemination, embryo transfer, some of those things that actually help us replicate these gene-edited animals at a greater quantity. When you think about gene editing, we have primarily focused on three, right, different categories. We've focused on animal health and welfare, right? We've focused on product yield and quality, and we've focused on, or groups have focused on, reproduction or novel breeding schemes. And so when we think about these three, right, obviously they're very important to the consumer, they're very important to production, and they're probably hard to measure or hard to make natural genetic improvement for. So when we start to think about the limitations that arise with gene editing, I got the question this week. They said, well, could we gene edit an animal for increased marbling? Right? Or could we gene edit an animal for increased growth? And I think when you think about those questions, for the traits that we already have EPDs for, those traits are really complex, right? They're controlled by lots and lots of genes. We call them polygenic, okay? These polygenic traits, we don't just have one or two genes that turn on and off for an animal that's gonna hit CAB, okay? So to be able to go in and gene edit an animal for a trait like marbling probably isn't realistic because there's too many genes, right, that control that individual trait. And so those are probably where we start to run into our limitations. What are the traits that we're actually going to start to edit for? Here are some of the traits that have actually been focused on in the literature. When we start to talk about animal health and welfare, we've talked about having no horns, right? Creating a polled animal. We talk about heat tolerance. We can talk about production and increased muscle yield. Eliminating allergens in our food for human consumption. We can talk about several other things like improved meat tenderness, resistance to disease. Those are the types of traits when we start talking about gene editing that we think could have promise moving forward. So when we attack these different categories of genes, what are we actually doing, right? So there's basically two types. There's a knockout and there's a knock-in, okay? The knockout is a deletion. Basically, you're going to go in, you're going to knock out a segment of DNA inside of the sequence. A knock-in is you're actually inserting, right, a sequence of DNA inside of that, or a partial bit of DNA inside of that sequence. Then there's two types, right, of gene edits. So they can be cisgenic, so that means that I'm taking DNA, right, from the same species. Okay, so maybe I have a breed of beef cattle that does really well at one individual trait or one individual gene, and I'm going to put it into another breed of beef cattle. Okay? The other part of it is transgenic. Transgenic is taking DNA from a different species and putting it into another species. Okay? So there's a difference. So we have knockout, knock-in, cisgenic, transgenic. When we think of the tools that are being used for gene editing, there's basically three types of tools that have been documented in the literature that have actually been used successfully for gene editing. So we have them listed up there, but the one that we should focus on is the last one with the CRISPR-Cas9. CRISPR-Cas9 is the winner when we start to look at the zinc finger nucleases, the talons, and then our last one. Why does CRISPR-Cas9 win out? It wins out because it has a high efficiency and precision. So the one thing we have to be careful of when we do gene edits is that we could go in and we could say, hey, I want to target this specific region, right, in the genome to edit. But guess what? We may actually edit some other place in the sequence as well. Okay, we call those off targets. With CRISPR-Cas9, it's the most efficient and precise, right, tool that we could use for gene editing, and we have much fewer off targets with this technology. It's technically simplistic in its design, so that's why a lot of universities, different university labs will pick it up, because to actually implement the protocol, it's fairly simplistic. And it's actually fairly cost effective. So we've had a couple of breeders in the US that have actually used this technology in accordance and in collaboration with a commercial laboratory, and they've done this in a very cost effective manner. So when we start to talk about CRISPR-Cas9, this is going to be the one when you hear about gene editing, in most cases, right, they're going to be using this particular technology. So how does it actually work? So basically when you talk about going forward with a gene edit, basically what we need to do is we need to get a sequence of DNA, and we have to sequence the DNA, and obviously you have to have something that you want to target, right? You've already found the trait, you already found what you have to turn on, what you have to turn off. You go in there, and you basically use CRISPR-Cas9, and it acts like a scissors, right? So you give CRISPR-Cas9 its target, it goes into your double-stranded DNA, and it actually cuts it, right? So if you know anything about DNA, what happens when you break it? It tries to repair itself, okay? That's what DNA does. So you go in there and you can cut it. Once you cut it, you can either delete the gene altogether, right? Or you can basically insert that portion of DNA that we were talking about. And so CRISPR acts as your scissors. You have your portion of DNA that can go in there and basically insert itself, or you can basically send it in with targets that says, hey, no, let's just close up this gap. And because DNA wants to repair itself, it's either going to repair itself with the new DNA or repair itself just without closing that missing link. So when you do this in a true animal production, what you have to start with is, in most cases, you're going to either start with an oocyte, right? Or you're going to start with a true embryo. And you're going to come around and you're going to do the gene edit in the embryo, right? Or the oocyte. So if you go down these two different lines here, if you go down these two different lines here, you have your donor female there in the middle. This is where you're going to collect your oocyte donor. So she's the female that you're going to take the egg out of. You're going to bring her up here, and you're going to either fertilize that egg, just like you would with a true embryo, or you're going to come over here and you're actually going to do the gene edit in the somatic cell. When you go through this, obviously you're going to do the fertilization of the embryo here. You're going to come over here. This is when, as that embryo is growing, that's when you're going to do your gene edit. Once you have that gene edit taking place, if that embryo is still alive and viable, you're going to go ahead and you're going to go in here and you're going to put her into a surrogate dam just like you would any other embryo. Okay? That embryo is going to live, going to grow, and then it's going to basically come out either with a calf that has the true edit, right? Has the true edit here, and that's what this homozygous mosaic animal, non-mosaic animal is saying, is that it has 2 copies of the edited cell line. Or you're going to come over here and you might have animals that either the edit never got passed on because it didn't actually take place here in this particular embryo. You have animals that have 1 copy of the edit, or you have animals that have the reverse copy of the edit. So this is why a lot of people do like to do this inside of the somatic cell line before fertilization, because you actually have it in the oocyte at hand rather than having to do it in the fertilized egg. So when you go into the documented literature, more than 75% of the gene edits are done with CRISPR-Cas9. Nearly 60% of those use cloning at some stage in the process. So you actually have an embryo that you go ahead and clone and do the gene edit inside of that cloned embryo. And there's basically 2 possible methods, 2 possible results that you'll get out of cloning, and that's that homozygous non-mosaic animal. So how could this work in a large commercial breeding scheme? The first thing it's going to do is it starts with the identification of these superior genetic lines. Once you have those, you can create a bunch of embryos. You bring them over here. You go in and you do embryo transfer. You can do your gene edits in those selected cell lines. You come down here. So in total, if you really went all the way from the start to finish process, you could basically have a gene-edited animal, right, out of your 2 highly selected lines within 9 months. Okay, so this process really doesn't take all that long once you have your scheme set up. And when we start to look at how this is actually taking place inside of our industry today, I wanted to share with you a couple of examples. So obviously this is some work. This has been done at a couple of different places. This is work that actually came out of Alison Van Niedenam's lab out of UC Davis. Basically what they did is they took in 1 generation a horned Holstein and made it polled, right? This again is kind of our welfare issue that we talked about earlier. Here's another idea where they actually took Nelore cattle, right, and they mutated the myostatin gene to actually increase, right, the amount of yield in those Nelore cattle. Obviously, this is the native Nelore. This is the animal that actually got gene edited for the double muscling gene. You come here, and this is one that we talk a lot about, and this is the slick hair gene. So basically, we could go in and target, right, a gene edit for a prolactin receptor that actually gives us an animal that looks like this one here on the screen, where it's very slick-haired, right? This is our normal animal that's hairy. It's got a lot of hair in the ears and all over its body. This slick animal has an increased heat thermal tolerance. And so when you hear a lot about gene editing right now, this slick edit is one that is obviously increasing in popularity for different environments, especially here in the northern part of South America. And then one that's been interesting for us to watch, we actually have an animal in the U.S. That's alive and is breeding cattle. This is a bull that actually was born black, right? He sired a lot of cattle. In the American Angus herd book that were black-hided, they actually went ahead and turned him red, okay? So they targeted not our red-black gene that we know here in our Angus populations, but it's actually a red CHARLA variant, where it's a double homozygous red variant, okay? That's dominant. So this red calf, right, he's a calf in this picture, but this red bull, basically, he has a dominant red gene, so that even if he gets bred to black cattle, the calves are going to come out red. Okay, so they did this one in this particular bull for a couple of different reasons.
but mainly it was for increasing, right, the genetic progress of the red Angus herd, because they took a high terminal black Angus bull, right, and were able to turn them red so they could register those red animals in the Red Angus Association of America herd book. Here's one that I think also is very interesting. What they did is they targeted the SRY gene on this particular animal. So our SRY gene has to do with the development of X and Y sperm, right, inside of a bull. So males obviously determine if offspring is going to be male or female. They've actually gene edited this particular animal so that he produces 75% male offspring. Okay? So when we think about that from a production efficiency, obviously we know that steers get into the feedlot, they gain more, they grow more, right? They're better set up for success from an efficiency perspective. So if we have bulls out there that can actually produce more steer progeny in the commercial cattle industry, that could be a really interesting result of gene editing. Here's another bull that is, or excuse me, another calf that has actually been gene edited for BVDV resistance. Okay, BVDV is something that we deal with in the US, and I'm sure you guys deal with here as well. This young calf is actually the gene edited live calf. He's been exposed several times with animals that have BVDV, and he's never picked up the strain of the virus. Okay, so these are real examples that are happening there. And this one it was done actually through our United States Department of Agriculture. And then finally, my last example here, and then I'll close, is basically this PRRS virus-resistant pig. So this porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus is obviously very devastating. It's devastating across the world. It can take out entire farms. Tens of thousands of pigs at a time. And basically this one is really interesting because this one got picked up by Genus. So Genus is the owner of the Pig Improvement Company, or PIC. You guys probably know ABS, right? ABS is basically a sister company to PIC. ABS is the beef side, PIC is the pig side. Basically what they're trying to do right now is they've created whole genetic lines of pigs that are resistant to PRRS. Okay? And they were about 50% through the regulatory process, right, to actually get this approved by the FDA, our Food and Drug Administration, in the US to be able to sell, right, and be able to have these PRRS-resistant pigs enter the food supply. Okay? So this, again, is one that's very real. It's one that's taken a really long time to get through our regulatory structures through the United States, but it's one that actually is a true vision. This isn't just one animal that got gene edited for no horns, or one animal that has the slick gene. These are whole genetic lines. So if this gets approved, basically they can continue and start breeding whole genetic lines of pigs in the US and around the world, where they would accept this gene edited animal pretty much overnight as soon as they get the okay from the US government. So from a breed association perspective, there are probably a couple of things to think about, okay? Obviously the question that we've wrestled with for the last couple of years has been this idea of, will these animals enter our American Angus Association registered herd book? Okay, and the reason for that is, as you think about gene editing, a lot of times you're probably going to be introducing maybe not a chunk of DNA from a different species, but probably a chunk of DNA from a different breed. Okay? So now does that open up our closed herd book, right? And should we allow those gene-edited animals for registration? Okay? That's been a question that we've discussed. Ultimately, we've decided that we are going to create policy around gene-edited animals, and the association has taken the approach of how can we include these animals into the herd book. And so then it becomes a discussion as to how do we want to report it, right? How do we track those gene-edited animals through our herd book? Those are two questions that we continue to create that policy around. And then the one question that we really don't have any control over, but we talk about a lot, is will it lead to proprietary genetic lines? Okay, and what I mean by that is obviously if I had this line of gene-edited animals, I've invested all the money in it myself, which isn't a small feat. Okay, I've invested all the time. Am I going to allow other people access, right, to these proprietary genetic lines? And then finally, something that hits home to me is how will we handle these gene-edited animals in our genetic evaluation? If we do find a gene for marbling or we do find a gene for growth, how are we going to model that inside of our genetic evaluations so it's not biased? All in all, gene editing is very real. It's very available. We have gene-edited animals all around. It can be done very effectively and at a very cost-effective standpoint when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. Gene editing may allow us, right, to quickly make genetic progress for traits that we're not even considering right now, or they're very difficult to get at. As associations, we need to think about how are we going to handle these gene-edited animals inside of our herd books. And then finally, I really believe that gene editing, right, it's not a replacement for all the things that we're doing today. It's not a replacement for all the hard work that people in this room have done as far as genetic selection. I see gene editing as one more tool, kind of like the cherry on top of our sundae, right? The last piece of the puzzle that, hey, if we get that cherry, it's probably going to be a pretty good day, but at the end of the day, it's not going to replace the rest of what we've done up until this point. So with that, I'm going to close, but if anybody has any questions, I think we have a little time for them.
Bueno, Kelly, hola, hola. Muchísimas gracias por esta intensa charla. En unos pocos minutos tuvimos el origen de la genética en Estados Unidos, su evolución. Una charla súper intensa de PDs, de genómica y, por supuesto, un tema totalmente nuevo en el mundo de hoy, que es la edición génica. Así que, como tú mencionaste, tenemos que estar preparados, ni abrir la puerta ni cerrar la puerta, dejarla entreabierta, como tú mencionaste hace un rato, dejar la puerta entreabierta en estos temas nuevos que seguramente se vienen en un futuro muy cercano.
Yep.
Así que muchísimas gracias. Si hay alguna pregunta, Barreto.
Pablo Barreto es mi nombre, me dijeron que lo diga. Quiero felicitar a la Asociación de Angus por este evento y a Kelly por su presentación. Se está hablando mucho en nuestro negocio de eficiencia de conversión. Me gustaría saber la opinión de Kelly, cuál es el ítem que nosotros debemos mirar y apoyarnos genómicamente para seleccionar eficiencia de conversión.
Feed conversion. Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, feed is one of the main drivers, right? When we talk about the profitability inside of our operations and our total cost, obviously feed is a big driver, right? It's one of our biggest costs that we have throughout our operations. So when we look at it from an American Angus Association perspective, we do have that on our priority list. We have our dry matter intake, right? Genetic predictions and our residual average daily gain EPD predictions that we use to basically get at feed conversion and feed efficiency. Genomics is definitely a tool that really helps us and enables us to make more genetic progress for feed efficiency. And the reason I say that is because genomics allows us to basically take really difficult or expensive to measure traits, right? Select and basically collect a small subset of phenotypes and then cast, right, those genetic predictions over a larger set of animals. So right now, when we think about our feed intake data that we have at the American Angus Association, on one of the slides that I showed, basically we have about 37,000 dry matter intake records, right? Individual animals that were measured in bunks, right? Measured how much they ate in those bunks. And we use those 47,000 records to with the combination of genomics and basically our gain data inside of our database to be able to make those predictions. And so I think genomics is definitely a tool that we need to couple with those types of records in order to make progress. I think the other thing that's interesting about feed efficiency, at least in the US, is the fact that we have the tools, but in order to make genetic gain, you actually have to select on the tools, right? I can make tools all day, but if nobody uses them, feed intake is one. Feed efficiency is probably one where we don't have producers that are putting as much, at least in the US, as much direct selection pressure on feed efficiency. Obviously, it has a high correlation with gain, right? And we've made a lot of selection pressure on gain. So I do think that we've accomplished some of it. But really where we're picking up our genetic selection for feed efficiency is the fact that we have it fit inside of our indexes, right? Our profitability indexes. And so they may not be directly selecting on it, but they're selecting on the indexes. So whole profitability from that standpoint. But it's an interesting battle in the US as well.
Thank you very much. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Tanto para Kelli Retallick o para John Stika, referido a la presentación previa de la certificación de carne en Estados Unidos. Bueno, si no tenemos más preguntas, estaríamos finalizando por acá. Agradecerle muchísimo a Kelli por haber venido al Uruguay. Compartimos varios días de gira, eternas charlas en el auto, así que agradecer todo el conocimiento compartido con nosotros. Angus Uruguay agradece la presencia en esta semana tuya, Kelli, y lo mismo John Stika, que nos acompaña, y también con la presentación que nos acaba de dar.
Perfect. Thank you.